Good afternoon. Welcome to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. My name is Preston Connor, and I will be your host today for the forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics was established in 1965 through the generous bequest of the Noble Foundation and Robert H. Hinckley. The Institute is dedicated to teaching students respect for practical politics and the principle of citizen involvement in government. The Hinckley Institute offers paid internships to students of all majors here locally in Washington, D.C., and in 35 countries around the globe. The Hinckley Institute also offers classes, the nation's only campaign management minor, week-long experiences to Washington, D.C., and over $70,000 in academic scholarships. We invite students to go next door or to our website at hinckley.utah.edu for more information. The title of today's forum is The Struggle for Equality and Citizenship in Arab Political Thought, Ideological Debates and Conceptual Change. Professor Tabitha Benny will introduce our guest.
Thank you all for joining us today. This is the second speaker in a series called Women in Politics. So we're delighted to have Dr. Michaelle Browers, who is an associate professor of political science at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. She's also an active member in Women and Gender Studies and Middle East and Asian Studies. Professor Browers teaches a variety of courses abroad in Egypt and Morocco in particular, and she writes on various aspects of contemporary Arab and Islamic political thought, including her two books, Political Ideology in the Arab World, Accommodation and Transformation Democracy, and Civil Society and Arab Political Thought, Transcultural Possibilities. Her articles have appeared in numerous journals, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, and the Journal of Political Ideology. And joining us also today with Professor Browers as her discussant is Lonnie Moon. She's a fourth-year PhD student here in the Political Science Department. Lonnie also studies comparative and political theory and is currently developing a project to help integrate and introduce non-Western texts into the traditional political theory curriculum. The ultimate goal here is to implement this into a comparative political theory course next year as part of a UTA. So help me welcome them both today, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you all for coming out today for this lecture and inviting me here to your beautiful campus, gorgeous campus you have here. I'd also like to thank Lonnie for the comments she's going to offer on my paper today. I really appreciate it, and I'm very excited to hear about the work she's doing here on comparative political theory, a field that, of course, I very much intersect with in multiple ways. As you can see from my title, I'm talking about something called Arab political thought. I want to suggest that it's not anything fancy I'm suggesting by that term. It's really a debate that's taking place primarily in Arabic texts, but not just texts, outside of texts as well, in context. It sometimes takes place in other languages, but I'm primarily focused on debates that go on in Arabic, occasionally debates in English by Arab intellectuals as well, and capturing something that I think is significant in some of the debates and discussions that go on there. To just give you an idea of where this all comes from, this project is just developing. In fact, what I'm presenting today was a paper that I originally presented in Morocco last spring. And I'll warn you that it was presented in about 45 to 50 minutes there. It's currently being revised for publication and is the basis for a project that I'm undertaking with some grant money to do some research in the region this coming year during a leave. So I'm going to do my best to get this down to a reasonable amount of time so that I can leave Lonnie plenty of time and hopefully get some questions and comments from all of you, because I am trying to do one last revision before it goes off to press. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation here. To give you an idea of where the project comes from, this comes out of observing the Arab uprisings, as I'm sure many of you watched and observed and perhaps even engaged with more directly. And the fact that analysts are still grappling with what to make of it. And the consequences of those events are clearly still unfolding. We have a number of assessments that are coming out, and of course I'm most interested in assessments about the political thought, the political theory, the ideas about politics that are emerging and that are coming to the fore. And there are a number of ideas that I've heard bandied about, and they are in many respects the ideas that I'm responding to with the research that I'm presenting today. The first is one that I've heard from so many uprising scholar activists at the number of conferences, workshops, other forums in which I have participated in the wake of the uprisings. And quite often when I go in as a political theorist and say, what are the intellectual origins of the ideas that you're talking about that are inspiring your activism, the most common answer I seem to get is that they view themselves and their activism as in many respects unprecedented, that they're not beholden to any previous movements or ideologies, and that they are, in a way, making their own ideas on the ground as they engage in activism, creating their own future without any past references to past models. And quite often this is articulated as a generational conflict, that in the past, activists were driven by all of these ideologies. We're sort of post-ideological in a sense. The second view is one that perhaps most frequently circulates among the analysts, academic and media analysts, trying to make sense of the way things have gone since the uprisings, the reassertion of authoritarianism, what some have termed the counter-revolution in the region. And they suggest that it's precisely the prevalence and resilience of authoritarian political ideas that is the problem. According to this view, and Egypt is often pointed to as the primary evidence, with the last presidential election ushering in another military man of a similar ilk of that of ousted President Hosni Mubarak, with policies that are very familiar when one considers the old regime. A third perspective, and this comes from much of the work on contemporary social politics and protests, more generally, not just particular to the Arab region, although the Arab uprisings are taken to be no different. They suggest that contemporary political protest is not really driven by ideas, or it lacks a vision. It may even lack a coherent body of principles to guide activists. And among those, probably the most prominent sort of articulator of this perspective is the political sociologist Sidney Tarrow, in his claim that it's precisely what he calls the generality of the message of these new social movements that allows their repertoire to travel so well from one instance to another, one context to another. This is a characteristic he terms modularity. And in fact, this last perspective, this sort of conclusion about contemporary social movements has become sufficiently commonplace that I think it warrants critical investigation. So in contrast to these views, I want to suggest the following. I'm going to argue that not only are the core of activists who inspired and for a time led the Arab uprisings articulating distinctive notions of central political concepts like citizenship, like equality, but their ideas neither lack precedent nor are they without some important shifts, in some cases even innovations, in thinking about these ideas when we look at the history of Arab political thought in the modern period. And so tracing the concept of citizenship in Arab political thought is my project. It reveals, I suggest, significant engagement both with earlier generations of reformist and revolutionary intellectuals from the Arab region, as well as quite significantly transnational engagements with critical political theorists across the globe. And what I did when I started out this project, because I haven't done all the research for it yet, this is, as I said, the beginning. This is the first stab at how I'm formulating my question and what I'm suggesting might be a way to formulate an answer. I just finished a book manuscript on Arab political thought in the post-World War II period that starts after the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance of the late 19th and early 20th century. I went back through the same material that I had written on in that book and looked. It's interesting as a political theorist when you cover the same material over and over again, right? To go through it with a new question in mind, and that's what I did. I wanted to see what all of these people were saying about citizenship. So it was a matter of finding when they used words that could be translated as citizenship, but it was also perhaps more substantively a matter of figuring out when they made claims or they conceptualized things in ways that were impactful for notions of what it means to be a citizen. And so part of what the first part of this project does is revisit sort of that prehistory to the Arab uprisings, looking for ideas about citizenship. And in the period of the Nahda, where I think I need to start with this, you have ideas about citizenship and equality being contested, shifting, changing. particularly in regard to the rights and responsibilities, as well as the basis of civic membership and the implications of those understandings for the character of the equality that's being sought. And so knowledge of that history, I think, is essential for establishing that backdrop to my analysis of what is and what is not distinctive about concepts of citizenship being articulated by many activists of the Arab uprising. And because political theory is a text-based enterprise, and we really do, as political theorists, go back to these texts and look at them, I'm going to bore you with quotes that I will not read to you aloud from some of the most significant thinkers who take on these topics. One, of course, being Rafat al-Tatawi, the Egyptian liberal nationalist, who you have sort of an account here of him comparing between what it is that he sees in Paris in 1834, in particular the document, the French Charter, and articulating what he sees for citizenship in the context of Egypt. We also have Muhammad Abdu in the same period, who some consider the founder of Islamic modernism, writing about citizenship. Abdu's student, Rashid Rida, talking about citizenship. And this is the part where I blow through what was a 45-minute lecture and make it into a 20-minute lecture. And I'll just suggest that despite the differences between these three figures, who are differently situated politically in terms of sort of the functions they're playing within the newly emerging Arab regimes of the time, and the differences sort of ideologically that they have, you have in each of their conceptions the development, and you see it, I think, very clearly here, the distinctive understanding of a sort of government-activated citizenry that directs citizens to become engaged in ways that gets them to focus and channel their energies towards the progress and development of the homeland, the Hubb al-Watan. So from there, I moved through to that post-independence period, focusing in particular on the 1960s, when you have the articulation of all sorts of distinctions between political notions of citizenship, economic notions of citizenship, different types of rights that sort of go along those two categories. And just these sort of distinctions are being made just as projects that are aimed at linking the two comes to the fore. I have a quote up here from Nasser, who, this is 10 years after he takes power in Egypt, delivering a speech in which he offers a sort of assessment of his first decade in office, and talking about citizenship in this way that draws attention to the economic as well as political components. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on a second articulation, because you have this theme, I think, developed with a bit more substantively than a politician's political speech in some of the work by the Moroccan political philosopher Mohammed Abd al-Jabri. And this is some of his early works. I'm going to talk about Jabri later on in this conceptual history, and he has a slightly different take on citizenship. In his early works, he's very much dealing with a very particular concept, context of 1964. But as I said, trying to sort of suggest that citizenship has both of these components, and that a political project that's going to aim at emancipating, at freedom, at garnering greater equality in a highly unequal context will require a comprehension of both of these things. And in this case, he's chastising those who would put more attention on one as opposed to the other. And I want to suggest as well that this theme of not only permeates more left-leaning, we might say, socialist and Arab nationalist intellectuals, but is also a central aspect of discussions surrounding citizenship among the Islamist intellectuals of the same period. We see this, I think, quite clearly in Sayyid Qutb's 1948 work, Social Justice in Islam, where he's articulating this notion of social justice based on Islam, premised upon Islamicizing state, society, and as well as citizenship in a way that draws together both social and economic aspects of justice. And in another work of about the same time, a little bit later, work that the author tells us was conceived in 1960s, early 1960s, but only published a decade later, you have the Algerian thinker Malik Benabi offering a very compelling account of how moments of citizenship, sort of in the sense that J.G.A. Pocock describes as membership in some public and political frame of action, get usurped by social forces that betray the original impulse of movements in order to exert power. And so he's in part offering a very rich account of theory falling short in practice, but he's also offering a critique of political elites who fail to carry out their promise of social and political development and sacrificing social ideas for selfish and material interests. So again, getting at sort of the economic and the political notions as well as social notions of citizenship and understanding not only their distinctions but how they each operate to make citizenship a meaningful concept. In the 1980s and 90s, you have debates over citizenship sort of following in a context that's very politicized in the wake of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, in the wake as well of the assassination by radical Islamists of Anwar Sadat in Egypt. You have a number of thinkers trying to sort of deal with the rise of political Islam as well as the rise of radicalism. And so you have a number of efforts aimed at forging a more inclusive notion that both heeds the political reality of resurgent Islamism and heeds concerns that many were raising about the impact of political projects aimed at Islamicizing state and society, and particularly focusing on the impact of those projects for non-Muslims or for non-Islamists, as well for women and other groups. And the main question of a lot of this literature was whether Islamists, should they gain power, would attempt to revive a notion of al-Hadimna, this idea of non-Muslims paying tribute to Islamic government in exchange for protection and the right of some measure of autonomy, for example, to govern their own affairs in mainly family and commercial law. And a number of intellectuals associated with a trend that we call wasatiyya, or moderate, or middleist, trying to reconcile modern notions of citizenship with some of the things that come through Islamic sources. So you have thinkers like Yusuf al-Qaradawi talking about this. You have perhaps, I think, most prominently this Fahmi Huwaidi, and also an Egyptian thinker. He's the one, in fact, that gets credited in much of the literature from the region with being the first to clearly and explicitly reject the category of dhimmi in favor of muwatana, in favor of full citizenship rights for non-Muslims. He's arguing that this dhimmi concept emerges in Islamic thought as a historically bound idea. It comes through a non-binding hadith, he says, and so it's left up to modern Muslims to conceptualize citizenship in a more inclusive manner that conforms to the requirements of equality and democracy. It's worth noting that the Moroccan political philosopher Abdelilah Belqaziz credits a Shiite thinker, Mohammed Hussein Al-Naini, with having done it before Fahmi Huwaidi, so it's not an uncontested idea, but Fahmi Huwaidi, at least in Arabic sources, and particularly in Egypt, gets the credit for sort of getting around this idea. But you have this renewed interest in exploring the religious dimensions of citizenship, and it's not being taken up only by the Islamists, right? It's being taken up as well on the left, and we see this again in the work, as I said, Muhammad al-Jabari will loom large in some ways in this project because he loves to talk about citizenship. But in the 80s, he's talking about it rather differently. He's talking about it in terms of the relationship between the heritage, the Islamic heritage, the Torah, and engaging the question of the relationship between authenticity and modernity. And he's not alone in this. There are others, Tariq al-Bishri from Egypt, Anwar Abdul Malik, Ahmed Siddiq al-Dajani, Tayyib Tazini, a number of thinkers at this time are taking up these questions. I think that, this engagement is really interesting because you'll remember that in the 1980s, those of you who study your sort of liberalism, you'll know that the communitarians at this time, people like Charles Taylor, Alistair MacIntyre, Michael Sandel, for example, are challenging liberal notions of the unencumbered self and positing in turn a socially situated self whose sense of identity remained bound up with certain values, beliefs, and practices. Although I do think the difference of context is highly important. Of course, we're communitarians in the West, where we're responding to the disenchantment with the hegemony of liberal individualism. You have Arab intellectuals, particularly those coming from the left, are grappling with a broader and more complex crisis, as they put it, in thought and practice that emerges from the politics of the time. But interesting, again, about this sort of transnational connection you get in this history. So let me talk about the contemporary. The Arab uprisings, from the perspective of political theory, were a fascinating moment, right? It garnered almost immediate attention from a number of political theorists. You have the Slovenian philosopher Žižek up here asserting that it was immediately possible for all of us around the world to identify with, to recognize what it was about, without any need for a cultural analysis of the features of Egyptian society. In fact, whereas in the pre-Arab uprisings history of Arab political thought that I've accounted so far, it's clear that many Arab intellectuals were in fact studying, sometimes appropriating, often responding, and sometimes critically, sometimes reacting to as well, trends and ideas that are often associated with the so-called West. What strikes one immediately about the international response to the Arab uprisings is the extent to which it inspired so much critical and democratic theory in Europe and the United States, right? We all remember the moments in Madison, Wisconsin, when you have the Tahrir Square activists sending pizzas to support this movement that was linked in many ways. And some would suggest inspired by Arab activist uprising, and of course, all sorts of occupying and like movements that seem to have this transnational component with some legs in what's going on in the Arab region. And you have a number of philosophers jumping on this, right? Žižek finds within the uprisings a radical emancipatory core. You have the French philosopher Alain Badiou finding, quote, fascinating similarity between the riots in the Arab world and the 1848 revolution in Europe, end quote, and proclaiming them to, quote, possess a universal significance and prescribe new possibilities whose value is international. A 2012 work by an American political theorist, Michaelle Ferguson, saw the example of the Egyptian protesters as a way to exemplify her argument that democracy is best seen not as a form of government embodied in institutions, but a world-building intersubjectivity activity. Another American political theorist in a 2013 book, Sam Chambers, says that to the extent that Egypt's revolution did not merely express pre-existing interests but constituted new ones, it was most decidedly political, that's his phrasing, and most distinctly democratic, again his phrasing, in the sense, he says, of the French political philosopher Rancière. And I should clarify that I don't mean to suggest that the Arab uprisings actually does exemplify and embody these novel ideas in recent democratic and critical theory, or that, in fact, these democratic and critical theorists somehow got it right. I do agree with much of what goes on in that literature, and I'll be drawing upon it in what remains here. But I do think there's some problem with seeing in that moment of 2011 what it is that we've been waiting for. And this, I think, becomes all the more apparent when it ceases to be what it is we're waiting for, right? And when the hopes of democracy give rise to this fear of renewed authoritarianism. Neither do I wish to suggest that the uprising activists that were spurred on by Rancière's or Žižek's theory, although it is certainly the case that many of the activists were articulating aspects of their uprising in precisely these terms. One of the terms that was quite often heard was the activists describing their uprising as rhizomatic, right, a great contemporary political philosophy term. And as I'll discuss in what remains, more than a few were reading, were responding to, were listening to some of the prominent critical intellectuals like Žižek, Rancière, and Badiou. So mulling over the uprisings, and this theory does suggest parallels, it does suggest commonalities, it does provide us, I think, some opportunity to weigh the optimism and idealism that we get in the literature against recent events, and of course the newer pessimism against what I take to be significant in these new articulations of citizenship. So there was a sense in which these ideas were in the air, as one of the people I talked to in Egypt suggested, circulating among, shared by, passed between activists across the globe. So some of the ideas that come through and parallels that I see, common to many contemporary critical theories accounts of the ontological significance of the political uprisings in the Arab region was what they call the appearance of something, the inexistent in Badiou's terms, or what Rancière calls the part without part. Right? Rancière says, quote, politics exists whenever the count of parts and parties of society is distributed by the inscription of a part of those who have no part. Badiou as well captures this in his claim that, quote, in Egypt, the people who had rallied in the square believed they were Egypt. Egypt was the people who were there to proclaim that if under Mubarak, Egypt did not exist, now it existed with them. And so we see this notion articulated, and we also see it represented in various ways. We see it in the waving of national flags, the lack of symbols associated with parties, and the marshaling of symbols related to religious groups in order to contest division, to assert a common cause, and assert a refusal perhaps to be divided as well. We heard and read the various versions of slogans that announced, "We are Egypt, we are Tunisia." We see this as well in the Egyptian activist Allah Abdel Fattah's claim that Tahrir was a myth that creates a reality in which we've long believed, right? And as well in the Egyptian scholar Adil Iskandar's claim that the body politic became the true anatomy and physiology of the public. You have all sorts of activist references, and even the naming of Tahrir as the Republic of Tahrir, suggesting this sort of reconstituted, liberated political body in the space occupied by protesters. There's been quite a bit of research done. One study I'll just mention, Selwa Ismail's really brilliant account of how Syrian activists used songs, chants in their protests to, as she put it, reimagine and perform the nation. And many protesters recall their protest activity as not just, in this case, an interaction between citizens and the state, but as an interaction of citizens with each other. One is struck, I think, at how even as the uprisings in Syria degenerated into a civil war, you have activists continuing and still continue to resist disunity, resist sectarianism through the unfurling of all sorts of banners. One of my favorite you have up there, "We are Syria" being claimed, saying we are Sunni, we are Alawi, we are Druze, and so on and so forth. All the distinctions you can possibly make, or just about all of them you could make in Syria, and suggesting that we are it, Syria, right here. Another idea that comes through in much of the writing and literature that I'm able to find so far from the Arab region is akin to what Michelle Ferguson talks about, this sense that the people in the streets stressed a vision of citizenship that's understood in terms of present political freedom rather than in terms of institutions to come. And it's through their collective agency that this is enacted. This is an idea as well we see in Rancière when he talks about it's in these movements of revolution. He says, quote, "where liberty and equality would no longer be represented in institutions of law and state, but embodied in the very forms of concrete life and sensible experience." He says that's where we see real democracy. And you get this in a number of thinkers. The French-Tunisian thinker Mehdi Belhaj Qasim directly asserts a relationship between the Tunisian Revolution and the ideas of Rancière, in that the revolution was carried out directly by the people, he says, the people who, quote, "wrote their own indelible page of history." You see it, I think, somewhat simply summed up in much of the graphic line artist Kaiser's work from Egypt, spray painted on the walls of Cairo, particularly this one that says, "We are the leader we've been waiting for." Right? It's this leaderless, horizontal character to the Arab uprising that gives it what Ali al-Raghal calls its rhizomatic character. He's one of these that likes this idea. This is how he describes it. "The Arab revolutions are rhizomatic struggles because they don't have a clear chain of command or a single point of reference. They've been successful as small entities linking together. The rhizome is a complex form of interaction. Even groups that used to be in opposition to one another are connecting." You have as well the work, again, of Adil Iskandar, who talks about how at the peak of the Arab uprisings, you have the moment where it didn't attempt to take over the main institutions of government, as he puts it, and assert its triumph over the state. And this is continuing the quote, "Rather, it simply asserted the stubbornness of human perseverance and liberty in the face of unbearable pain and agony. It did not try to undo the constitutional order with disorder, but rather respected the need to demand change and expected that its show of force would be enough to guarantee the legitimacy of these demands." Iskander is actually citing Badiou as the source for some of his thinking through of what he witnessed and participated in Egypt. He says, quote, "Politics is outside the framework of reconnecting bonds and or the search for a more representative and democratically accountable government. For Badiou, as for Egypt, politics is about the meticulous unbinding of the democratic representative system." On the other hand, there are other thinkers who conceived it slightly differently, but not in entirely unrelated terms. Fawaz Trabulsi, a Lebanese leftist intellectual, has published a number of books about the Arab uprising. He, in his first of those 2 books, deconstructs the now famous slogan, "The people want the downfall of the regime," to suggest that it was not just its distinction between the people and the regime, but also the very novelty of those 2 components that's important in here. According to Trabulsi, the discourse of civil society and state, which was so prominent in the 1990s, so prominent that I wrote a book about it. That was my first book, in fact. He said that that language that was so prevalent during that time has given way to a new language of people and regime that he says recalls some of the revolutionary stances of the national liberation movements of the 1970s. The slogan, he says, constructs an inclusive and equal notion of the people in contrast to both civil society and other things that might divide that people, like sex or other social divisions. And so in a sense, I think he's making a slightly different sort of reference point than Askander. Askander, of course, relating this notion to Bidou. And thank you. And Trabulsi suggesting that it has its origins in 1970s radical movements in the region. But Trabulsi agrees, I think, otherwise. At the same time, though, he's making a note about how people not calling for the downfall of the regime, the state, that is, the institutions that govern, but the regime in the sense of the system of power in place, which would include not just the authoritarian system, but also the neoliberal order that sustains it, is a broader and more radical call that he suggests warrants our characterization of these uprisings, despite their rhizomatic character, he might say, as revolutionary. So the parallels are being made, not only by people in the so-called West, but by Arab activists and intellectuals who are fighting these struggles. There is a response, and I'm going to just sort of fly through this period. I can talk about it a bit more in the Q&A. Zizek, in particular, who is well heard in the Arab region. He's on Al Jazeera. He writes columns for papers. His ideas circulate, and if anyone knows anything about Zizek, you know he likes to spout off about just about anything that strikes his fancy. So he said a number of things, particularly disenchanted with the course of events in Syria and Egypt, that have suggested this was not the revolution we were waiting for, that mistakes were made, problems were made, it was not sufficiently radical in various ways. And there's been a significant response by Arab intellectuals and activists to Zizek, and I have just a few of the very powerful responses. You'll see Layla Zahra Mortada, actually, she doesn't have an A at the end of that, very outspoken in her response to it. Also, Yassin al-Haj Saleh, who's a Syrian activist, and our Algerian Mehdi Belhaj Qasim as well, responding. And I want to draw attention not only to sort of how there has been this response by intellectuals situated in the West, but also that response not going unnoticed or unresponded to by activists in the Arab region, because I want to end by suggesting that we need to ask whether our celebration of a grand ontological and historical event, our surprise perhaps at the appearance of the void or the inexistent, to use Rancière's term, merely marks and masks our ignorance and inattention to some of the more mundane ongoing struggles for freedom, democracy, and justice in the region. And so to suggest as well that we have to think further and think more critically about our tendency to, at the one moment, cheer events of a certain character, those in Zizek's words where it's immediately possible for all of us to identify with it, while at the next moment noting that it will never be enough. And so at the end of all this, and despite the period of counter-revolutions, stalled revolutions, failed states, there's a whole violent reassertions of Islamic states as well, a whole host of articulations about where things have arrived and where they're going. Here is what I want to suggest I take to be distinctive about the generation that brought us the Arab uprisings and their reconceptualizations of the idea and practice of citizenship that they articulate. And this is that it's not so much that their understanding of citizenship as only meaningful when justice and equality are sought in a more comprehensive sense than a merely liberal, territorial, political notion of citizenship offers, right? Not only that they're suggesting that those original Tahtawi notions are insufficient in some way, it's not only that their comprehension of citizenship is some sort of action, some sort of struggle. Earlier generations, right, wielded various conceptions of ideas related to struggles for independence, socioeconomic reform, and in the names of various conceptions of justice. But it's rather the distinctiveness of their notion of citizenship that it's found in their grasping of citizenship as action and of the citizen and of people as constituted in the acting. This idea of citizenship as an unfinished project, this idea of citizenship as something that needs to be continually reinvented and reinterpreted to remain, in Malik Ben-Abi's words, expressed ideas that are both genuine and efficacious. Or in Kaiser's view, as something that we need to continue to remember, this last line, that we remember tomorrow, that we always remember the tomorrow that didn't come, or will we remember the tomorrow that never comes. So a little bit of Kaiser graphic art to sort of end this. So let me end there and turn things over to Lonnie for comment.
So first I want to thank Professor Browers again for coming and speaking with us here today. Her willingness to be a mentor to me is also an invaluable opportunity and part of this women's speaker series. But to begin, I would like to acknowledge the importance of her engagement with Arab political thought in order to better understand Arab uprisings. While this may seem intuitive, it is often the case that Western political thought is employed to understand and explain non-Western phenomena, which she illustrated in the works of Ferguson, Badiou, Zizek, Rancière, and Chambers. It should be noted, however, that when I use the term West and non-Western, I intend to do so surrounded by scare quotes, as these labels come with their own set of problems. But while Professor Browers is primarily an Arab and Islamic thinker, she is also situated within comparative political theory, which is a relatively new subfield dedicated to cross-cultural learning and expanding the traditionally West-centric canon of political thought to include non-Western texts. Scholars engaged in this work argue that ignoring these texts is no longer tenable in a globalizing age in which interaction with different cultures and civilizations is unavoidable. They argue that this is an important move for political theory to remain relevant in a globalized world, and here we've been given the opportunity to interact with and understand what comparative political theory is meant to accomplish. So first, Professor Browers has guided us through the history of Arab political thought to discover this rich dialogue concerning equality, freedom, duty, patriotism, economic and political rights, education, and so on. In this, we don't find foreign ideas tied to foreign lands, but rather a dialogue in a much larger global political community. For example, Abdu's theory of popular will is not unlike Rousseau's idea of the general will. Al-Jabri's discussion of political versus economic rights in the 1960s is similar to Western reactions towards Marxism and capitalism. And certainly Tahtawi's conviction of political education cultivating social virtues and civilized society does not sound radically different from our American pragmatists such as John Dewey. And if this doesn't immediately capture our Western interests, she draws us in further by identifying the ways in which European and American scholars engaged with Arab uprisings. Here we find theories that maybe we once encountered as adequately engaging. But I must stop myself because comparative political theory is not about packaging non-Western texts into a tidy little box for Western benefit. It is helpful to understand similarities and differences, and some compare and contrast is necessary, but Professor Browers does this implicitly without demarcating the West and the rest. In this way, we have the opportunity to develop an awareness and an appreciation for alternative possibilities to Western thought, rather than a fusion or divisive us versus them mentality. And Professor Browers has offered us this opportunity by re-engaging with European American scholars through an Arab lens. While we may have been drawn to Zizek's theory of the absent third, or his conclusions that protesters have become passive observers, we are now privy to understanding why this is not only insufficient, but also, as Al-Hajjaj Salah wrote, it is irresponsible and insensitive to human suffering. Professor Browers concluded that the generation that brought us the Arab uprisings have a distinctive notion of citizenship, in part because they are able to view citizenship as an unfinished product that must be constantly reinvented and reinterpreted to remain expressed ideas that are both genuine and efficacious. If we could apply this mode of expression to the practice of political theory, engaging with non-Western texts with a mindset that political theory itself is an unfinished product through reinterpretation, we can, too, remain genuine, relevant, and efficacious. This may, however, sound too ideal. Where do we even begin with such a tall task? What can we as students, friends, aspiring academics, mentors, and scholarship committees, for any of you out there, do to support this kind of endeavor? In other words, what difference can we make, and why is this so important? So I will turn back to Professor Browers to help us answer these questions, and I encourage questions from the audience following that. Thank you.
So I would like to take questions, comments, hear what you think about all of this, and I'll try to integrate, maybe an incorporation of some of the things that Lonnie suggested in her talk in the process. Oh, do you want to give me, or you want to give it to the audience?
Yeah, I'm going to take this
all
one.
right.
If you have any questions, please state your name and maybe something about yourself and speak into the mic.
Hi, my name is Perry Schwartzsham. I'm a member of the Political Science Department. So when you think about Zizek, is he being irresponsible, or is he starting a conversation that needed to be started? I mean, how should we think about him? That he's simply spouting off, I think was the phrase you used. So does he lack humility, or is he ignorant, or was it a good thing that he started this conversation, or is that giving him too much power to say that he started a conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I think he's being intentionally provocative, and he sees provocation as productive, right, precisely for starting those conversations. But, of course, the activists see him as being irresponsible because of the power that he wields as this Western intellectual who has now declared the end of their uprising, as they're sitting there fighting on and suffering and going to prison and still struggling in various ways. And so, yeah, I think to some extent we need to take responsibility for declaring the end of something. The attention of Western powers was so intense for a moment, and the intention, particularly as I draw attention to Western intellectuals as cheerleaders of the Arab uprisings. And now as naysayers, that has an impact as well. And I think we need to consider, the power relationship there a little bit more carefully. And I think it also, it erases things. It erases those struggles that are ongoing and the struggles that predated the Arab uprisings, when we only take note and we declare it ended when we lose interest. So I think there's real problems in what he suggests. But he has engendered a response that, unfortunately, outside of maybe what you're seeing here today, isn't getting a lot of attention. But my work, I hope, is in part an attempt to sort of highlight those responses so that we don't think this is that this is a finished project.
Hakan Yavuz. Well, Michelle, thanks for your this thought-provoking talk. I have two questions. One, don't you think that we are exaggerating role of ideas or political theory, what happened in Egypt? Because what we see, the outcome, it is not a revolution. Even I wouldn't consider it fully uprising, but rather an outburst. That here the conditions or practice might lead to some kind of political theory or some evolution of a new cognitive map. But the whole set of events, what we see, is not led by systematic ideas, but rather some concerns. This situated self, as you mentioned, in terms of political oppression, worsening economic situation, and also this role of digital technology. This is the generation, or one might call it a cyber generation of Egypt, and they cannot think and write more than 20 or 50 words of Twitter message that they as you know, organize through the cyberspace, and you don't see much intellectual debate and discussion, and this whole outburst, what I call, is not led by an intellectual, but rather a set of cyber generation activists. And again, when we look at what they put out in terms of ideas, it is really something like a hadith, such as your fear is their power. The hadith means the short sentences of Prophet Muhammad. So it is something like a slogans rather than thinking in terms of the, there's not much analytical thinking. And then now I call it an outburst, even not an uprising in terms of a systematic change, not a revolution at all, because what we see, the old elite is back to the system in Egypt, but in some other cases the situation is much worse. So it failed. Even if you consider it as an uprising, this is a failed uprising, and the question becomes why. And one might argue that maybe there was no lack of systematic ideas which led the people or captured their imagination, but rather it was a random act. And so I would like to hear how you would react to the failure, and also why should we privilege here the role of ideas, but what we see the practice here, the daily issues and oppression, what leads these people. Maybe the ideas might develop afterwards, that they might led by what is going on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm suggesting that the problem is not the ideas, right? What I'm showing is that their ideas are distinctive and productive and engaged in various ways. And I'm not suggesting, I'm suggesting that in fact when we look at, and this disappeared again, we look at sort of our response to this, when we say that it failed, that nothing is changed, we're overlooking something significant that has changed in ideas. Now, I'm not arguing that in fact practice is going to fall upon theory, right? Theory does not lead, different ideas do not necessarily lead to different practices. When you have all sorts of material conditions that are challenges, economic issues, you have political structures in place. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just trying to get us to rethink the idea that because we've declared this a failure, that nothing has changed, that it's just a return of more of the same. I want to suggest, in fact, if you look at it from the perspective of the history of ideas, that something new and innovative is going on. I'm not making claims about what this will mean in practice. So I want to be clear about that. I think you've also raised an interesting question that I'm grappling with right now, and as I said, this is sort of the beginning of the study about what we think of as an intellectual. I think that's being challenged right now. And again, I'm sort of arguing this idea that there's this lack of thought as well. The activists, certainly, write graffiti, write slogans. I mean, one of the challenges of this project is that this generation of activists, quite often in the course of the uprisings, was putting their message in not only graffiti, but in songs, in works of art, in performance pieces of various types. And, you know, from the perspective of a political theorist who likes the text that I gave you when I went through my history, I haven't quite found the material that looks like traditional political theory. So part of what I'll be doing in Tunisia and Egypt, and what I've already done in Lebanon, is looking where they're writing, where they're doing things that look a little bit more like political theory. And they are writing. I mean, it's not the case, in fact, that there's no intellectual activity. There are all sorts of, in fact, there's a lot of discussion, not all of it online, that involves people getting together and having conversations, sometimes around these sort of non-traditional theorizings, these works of art, performance pieces, movies are being made, books, novels. There's this whole sort of new generation of novel writing that addresses sort of a social realism of a sort. But they're also starting journals, right? And in Lebanon, I spent a lot of time looking at this new journal, Bidayat, Beginnings, which is supposed to capture a certain type of, a certain generation of progressive intellectuals, is how it's, and then Fawaz Trabulsi, who's a dinosaur among the left, I hope he doesn't hear this recording, he's a good friend, is the beginner of that. But he's taken a lot of care to sort of get these activists to put their thoughts into writing. And so it's a really vibrant forum for articulating some of these things. And I'm finding little bits of these in my research from here in Tunisia and Egypt. And so part of my aim is to go there and try to figure out what I can find in terms of writings that is a bit more systematic and sustained than a hadith or a text message. And there is. I mean, I've already found quite a bit of it. There's some of it already in this paper. I'm convinced that there is a lot more to be found. But I do think that I'm running into the fact that they're not political theorists, right? The generation of activists are not political theorists in the sense that Fawaz Trabulsi is a political theorist, right? They're not sitting down and writing books that think about these ideas. They're writing articles. They're posting on blogs. They're writing all sorts of artistic works, fictional works, but they're addressing precisely these issues, and they're doing it together, and they're doing it in ways that converse, right? They're finding that sort of dialogue. So I think I'm going to have to ultimately, I think, rethink what I think of as an intellectual, and perhaps rethink about the material of political theory a little bit through doing this project. So there's another component to this that will be part of the larger project. What do you mean by political theory? To what extent is Sidney Taro right that there is this generality, this sort of modularity to the discourse we get out of these movements? But to what extent can we find something that is meaningful for articulating notions of political theory around concepts like this?
Ali Al-Husseini, PhD candidate. Do you see any similarities between the 2005 uprising, since you worked a lot in Lebanon at Martyr Square there, and then since Lebanon now it's been 10 years, and we see the outcome where there was an intra-elite fight that led to the people that did the uprising being hostage of today's elite in Lebanon. And similarly in other places where the parties or militias or groups like the Brotherhood won, even though the organizers had nothing to do with the Brotherhood. Do you see, where do you see this is going? How do you see this is, you know, we as the people, or as you said here, he talks about what's the changes happening. We try to do something, but the outcome ends up being something else because we are hostage of our elites. So do you raise that question? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a relationship between the so-called Cedar uprising in Lebanon, the Green March earlier in Iran as well. I mean, there is a modularity quality, right, as Taro says, to these movements. And in fact, the last book that I published, the second book I did, was looking at sort of the intellectual backstory to what I was observing in a lot of these protest movements at the time. I was interested in particular how it was that you had leftists and Islamists and Arab nationalists and some liberals coming together to protest, sometimes on the same side on these issues. And I was interested in how they forged sort of a language to sort of bring about this working across divides that an earlier generation would have been unthinkable. And so, to some extent, it is those periods of activism, right, that laid the foundation, the framework, that not only sort of gave the common vocabulary and language, the political theory stuff that I like, but also built personal connections, right? If we look at network theory, I think it has a lot to say about precisely the types of connections that were made so that they could, in fact, mobilize using social media, some new technology, in order to have the uprisings that we saw in 2011. Where it's going, I'm not going to be able to answer that question for you. I think I would be making a Zizek move if I started to give you a forecast. But let me just say that I don't think it's over, and it's not. I mean, it's an ongoing project. I don't know where it's going, but I do encourage us all to keep our attention on these struggles that are ongoing and not declare them dead before their time. So I will end there. Thank you all for your attention and for your comments and for your questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.